Balancing a demanding project management job with a husband who travels for medical sales 3 days a week leaves very little room for error. When their second child arrived, the family's schedule fractured entirely. The fix was hiring a 26-year-old nanny named Maria. She was competent, warm, and within 2 months turned a chaotic environment into a functioning household. Minor discrepancies began to accumulate shortly after Maria expanded her duties to include tidying the master bedroom. A $20 bill vanished from an envelope of emergency cash in a kitchen drawer, and a week later, a grandmother's gold bracelet disappeared from a jewelry dish. The tension escalated on a Tuesday afternoon. Arriving home 2 hours early, the wife walked in to find Maria speaking in a low, urgent, and distinctly uncomfortable tone on the kitchen phone. Seeing her employer, Maria abruptly hung up, offering a rehearsed excuse about a family emergency that felt out of sync with her usual easygoing demeanor. That evening, the wife brought these concerns to her husband, Stephen. He dismissed the pattern as parental anxiety, suggesting she was miscounting cash and misplacing jewelry. He packed his bags and left for a 4-day work trip the next morning, leaving her to sit with her suspicions alone. When you are convinced something is wrong under your own roof and your partner refuses to see it, the resulting isolation is heavy. This specific kind of psychological pressure often pushes rational people to cross ethical lines to regain a sense of control over their own home. She decided to install a small audio-free camera disguised as a household object. After verifying that recording common areas in her own home was legally permissible in her state, she placed it on a living room bookshelf. It offered a clear view of the entryway, the kitchen door, and the stairs. For the first week, the recorded files offered nothing but reassurance. Maria was patient during toddler tantrums and encouraging during after-school reading sessions. Watching a competent caregiver do exactly what she was hired to do sparked intense guilt in the woman who placed her under surveillance. Still, reviewing the files became an obsessive nightly ritual. After the kids were asleep, she would sit in the dark, watching her family move through the spaces of their shared life while she was absent, acting as a silent spectator in her own living room. By the 8th day, the lack of any concrete evidence nearly broke her resolve. She started to believe Stephen was right. The cash was miscounted, the jewelry was lost, and the camera was the product of a stressed mind. She was days away from taking the device down. A prolonged stretch of domestic quiet often serves as the perfect camouflage. The absence of an immediate threat creates a false sense of security, masking underlying fractures right up until the moment they give way. The break in the pattern happened 40 minutes into that night's footage. The front door opened and Stephen walked in, setting down his bag. He was supposed to be in another city and was not due back for 2 more days. He greeted the children, but the camera captured a sharp shift in the room's atmosphere. The moment Stephen walked in, Maria's posture immediately stiffened into something highly guarded. Mapping this footage against his travel calendar over the following 2 weeks exposed a precise, undeniable pattern. On days when Stephen was supposedly out of town, the camera captured him arriving at the house. He would stay for 20 to 30 minutes in the early afternoon, then leave before his wife returned from work. Every secret visit followed the exact same routine. After a brief greeting with the kids, Stephen would ask Maria to step into the kitchen. They would stand just outside the camera's line of sight, engaging in a hushed conversation while the children watched television, before Stephen quickly exited the house again. Watching this sequence repeat, the logical explanation seemed obvious. The work trips were fabricated cover stories, allowing Stephen to return home to spend time with the nanny while his wife was hundreds of miles away at the office. Yet the visual evidence resisted that conclusion. If this was a hidden romance, there should have been some warmth in their body language. Instead, Maria's physical cues communicated intense anxiety. These quiet interactions looked more like a hostile negotiation. When faced with partial evidence, the human mind instinctively organizes it around its worst existing fears. By forcing the footage to fit the narrative of infidelity, it becomes possible to stare directly at a major crisis and completely misunderstand what is actually happening. The reality of the situation broke open on a Thursday afternoon. Sitting at her desk at work, the wife received a motion notification during a time when the house should have been quiet for nap time. She opened the live feed and watched Stephen's car pull into the driveway. Stephen let himself in with his key, and as Maria looked up from folding laundry on the couch, she didn't show surprise. She looked exhausted, reacting with weary resignation to an unwelcome, expected routine. Because it was daytime, the ambient noise in the house was lower, and the camera finally picked up their audio. Stephen was audible for the first time, asking Maria if she had moved it yet, or if the account was set up. He sounded desperate, using a tone that carried no affection. Maria responded with clipped, uncomfortable refusals, stating she did not want to be involved any further. Hearing the words account and move it reframed the entire investigation. The suspicion of an affair was replaced by a much colder, transactional reality. Maria was being pressured into a financial arrangement she clearly wanted no part of, leaving the wife with a new, much larger question: why did Stephen need a secret account in the first place? That night, she called her sister, a finance professional. After hearing the sequence of missing items and hushed arguments, her sister asked one targeted question: had she examined their joint bank accounts, line by line, recently? Catching systemic rot requires you to abandon the distractions of immediate interpersonal suspicions. You have to stop looking at the symptoms and point your attention directly at the foundational systems, the ledgers and accounts, that you naturally assume are the safest. Looking closely at the joint accounts, the truth was visible in the transaction history. Massive transfers, ranging from $800 to over $2,000, were being systematically drained from their joint savings. The dates of these outbound transfers matched perfectly with the days Stephen claimed to be on his regional sales trips. The financial autopsy uncovered a spiraling crisis. Stephen had developed a severe sports betting addiction. Because he handled the household bills and budgeting entirely on his own, he had been able to quietly accumulate a massive, compounding mountain of debt stretching back 2 years before Maria ever set foot in their house. The footage of those secret visits now had a clear purpose. Stephen was using the house as a physical drop-off point for cash intended for private lenders, while simultaneously pressuring Maria to hide the digital trail by using her personal bank accounts. When the wife laid the printed transaction logs on the kitchen table 2 days later, the deception ended. Faced with the organized financial evidence and the exact timeline of his movements, Stephen completely collapsed, dropping all excuses and confessing to the entire operation. The early discrepancies resolved alongside the confession. Stephen admitted to taking small amounts of cash from the kitchen drawer to cover immediate interest payments. The bracelet, however, was an unrelated mistake. Maria had found it snagged in a blanket and placed it in a dress-up bin, where it had been sitting for weeks. The person granted total, unchecked authority over a system is uniquely positioned to dismantle it. Because they control the information flow, they can systematically drain resources for years without ever triggering an external alarm. Maria had carried this knowledge in silence for weeks. She had noticed the unusual cash exchanges and pieced together the financial trouble long before the camera was installed. But the severe power imbalance of being a new household employee kept her silent. She was terrified that accusing her employer's husband of financial ruin would result in her losing her job. The financial recovery required severe measures. The couple had to refinance their mortgage to consolidate the predatory, high-interest loans, stalling their future plans. The only resources that survived the fallout were the children's college funds, simply because the mother had set them up in separate accounts that Stephen couldn't access. This required a harsh personal reckoning. The wife had to accept that her total willingness to cede financial oversight to her husband is exactly what created the dark space where his addiction was allowed to thrive undetected. Surviving this required a completely new operational reality. Alongside intensive addiction and couples counseling, their household finances were entirely restructured. Today, there is a mandatory, verified system of equal visibility and control over every single joint and individual account. True security cannot rest on the assumption of good behavior, even from the people we love the most. It demands an active, sometimes uncomfortable level of transparency, ensuring that no one is ever left with enough unmonitored power to hide a catastrophe right in the middle of your living room.